Imagine you hear on the news that a country has enriched uranium to 60%. Most people either panic, shrug, or quietly wonder, what does that even mean? Is that a bomb? Is that dangerous? Should I be worried? You probably nodded along to the headline, but if someone asked you to explain it right now, you might struggle to put it into words, and that is completely normal. Because the story behind how Iran reached 60% enrichment is not just a science story, it is a political story, a trust story, and honestly, a very human story about what happens when agreements fall apart. Let's go back to the beginning. Uranium enrichment is not a new idea. It started in the 1940s during the race to build the first nuclear weapon. Scientists discovered that natural uranium, the kind you dig out of the ground, is mostly made of a version called U-238, but the version that actually creates a powerful chain reaction is U-235, and in nature it makes up less than 1% of all uranium. To make uranium useful, you have to increase that percentage. That process is called enrichment. For decades, only a handful of countries knew how to do this. It required massive machines called centrifuges, which spin uranium gas at incredible speeds, gradually separating the heavier atoms from the lighter ones. The higher the percentage of U-235 you reach, the more enriched the uranium becomes. Low enrichment, around 3 to 5%, is enough to power a nuclear reactor and generate electricity. Around 20%, you can fuel certain research reactors. At 90% or above, you have weapons-grade material. That is the level used in nuclear bombs. So where does 60% fit in all of this? Here is what most people assume. They hear 60% and think Iran is almost at a bomb. That is the popular headline, but the reality is a little more complicated, and understanding that complexity matters. Iran's nuclear program started in the 1950s with full American support. Yes, the United States actually helped Iran build its first research reactor under a program called Atoms for Peace. Iran signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968, agreeing to keep its program peaceful in exchange for access to nuclear technology. For years, it ran a modest program. Then came the 1979 revolution, which changed the relationship between Iran and the West entirely. Through the 1980s and 1990s, Iran quietly expanded its program, building enrichment facilities and buying centrifuges through networks that weren't always transparent. By the early 2000s, the world discovered that Iran had been enriching uranium in secret. This triggered years of sanctions, negotiations, and international pressure. In 2015, a major agreement called the JCPOA was signed. Iran agreed to cap its enrichment at 3.67%, reduce its uranium stockpile, and allow international inspectors inside its facilities. In exchange, global sanctions were lifted. It was not a perfect deal, but it was a working deal. Then, in 2018, the United States withdrew from the agreement under the Trump administration. Sanctions came back, harder than before. Iran waited about a year, then began stepping away from its own commitments, gradually and deliberately. First, it went to 5%, then 20%, then 60%. Each step was announced publicly. Each step was a message. This is where the misunderstanding lives. Most people think 60% means Iran is secretly racing toward a bomb. But Iran has been loudly and openly doing this. Every increase has been announced, documented by international inspectors, and tied directly to political demands. Iran is essentially using its enrichment level as a bargaining chip, saying, lift the sanctions, return to the deal, and we will walk this back.
Now, 60% enriched uranium is genuinely concerning to nuclear experts, because going from 60% to 90% is technically easier than going from 20% to 60%. The hard part of enrichment is the beginning, so the higher you go, the shorter the path to weapons-grade material becomes. Experts call this breakout time. meaning how long it would take a country to produce enough weapons-grade material for one bomb if they decided to sprint for it. Iran's breakout time has shortened considerably. But there is a difference between capability and intention. Iran having shorter breakout time does not automatically mean it has decided to build a weapon. It means the situation is more urgent, more fragile, and more in need of a diplomatic solution than ever before. The reason this misunderstanding persists is because nuclear news is genuinely hard to translate into everyday language. Percentages sound technical, politics gets oversimplified, and fear fills in the gaps where understanding is missing. When people hear 60%, they either catastrophize or tune out entirely. Neither response is useful. The smarter way to think about this is like a pressure gauge. Iran has been turning up the pressure deliberately and incrementally to force a negotiation. Whether that strategy works, whether it leads to a new agreement or a further breakdown, depends on decisions being made in capitals far from any centrifuge. So here is the honest summary. Iran reached 60% enrichment not through a secret weapons sprint, but through a calculated, visible response to a broken agreement. The number is serious, the situation is real, but it is not the end of the story. Understanding the difference between enrichment levels, between capability and decision, between technical facts and political theater gives you a much clearer picture than any single headline ever could. The most dangerous thing about nuclear news is not the uranium. It is assuming you already understand it when you do not. If this gave you a clearer picture of something that usually feels confusing, go ahead and like the video. Share it with someone who only knows the headline. And if you want more of these deep dives into the stories behind the news, subscribe. There's always more beneath the surface than what gets reported.